Hey guys, welcome back for today's lecture for Monday, April 27th. We'll have a Zoom meeting today at 2. I posted on Classroom. It'll be for those that have some missing work for me. So if your name is on the list that I posted on Classroom of people that don't have to come, then you can sit this one out. You can come if you want to, but you really don't need to. But if your name's not on that list, I need you there so we can get you caught up, get that taken care of. So last week we talked about Truman and his concept of uh, containment. We talked about the Korean War and the concessions made in splitting Korea in half, and uh, the the losing of North Korea to communism as well as China, um, but saving Japan from communism as well as Taiwan. So we're going to go through this whole chapter. I said we're gonna break it down president by president because each of their individual approaches to the Cold War or to foreign policy is really what defines this era. So we got through Truman's containment. Now we're going to get into Eisenhower and his concept of what was known as brinkmanship. Now, brinkmanship wasn't necessarily an Eisenhower created ideology, it was more attached to his Secretary of State, John Doles. John Doles was a big proponent of brinkmanship. Now you're asking, what's brinkmanship? Brinkmanship is purely pushing your opponent to the brink of, in this case, warfare. You know, pushing them to the maximum before the fight will erupt or ensue, and hoping that uh, the danger of conflict is enough to get them to back down. Now, this is considered a high risk, high reward style of diplomacy. On one hand, if you can kind of scare your opponent into backing down, it gives you a ton of power and it creates a lot of momentum for you. On the other hand, if they don't back down, well, then you've gone too far and nuclear warfare is going to erupt. This brings about John Dole's theology of massive retaliation. You know, anything he believed anything the Soviets do, we have to come back at them twice as hard. You know, we can't let alone back down. We can't even retaliate in an equal form. We have to outdo them. And again, that's a very dangerous plan. But Eisenhower believed in the domino theory, which is if one country or region falls to communism, then everyone around them is subject to communism. And we see that. I think back to world history. Think back to when America gets its independence. We founded this country on the principles of self-governing and democracy and republicanism. And then within 25 years, France goes through uh, a democratic revolution, and then that spreads throughout Europe. And now, today, we see a world of, 60 to 70% of the world is some form of democracy. Well, and you think that happened kind of quickly. Well, now think of communism. Soviet Union falls to communism in the 20s, and then China becomes communist, and then North Korea becomes communist, all within 30 years. And then Japan faces a threat, and now Vietnam is going to face a threat. All of Southeast Asia is going to face a threat. Like, this is going to spread quickly, and we'd better be able to contain it or be able to fight it. So Eisenhower passes through what was called the Eisenhower Doctrine. It's the same as it's just like the Truman Doctrine. If you remember, the Truman Doctrine was pledging any kind of help, whether it be financially or militarily, to the European countries that are fighting communism. But the Eisenhower Doctrine was pledging money or military forces to anybody in the Middle East fighting communism. And the big target of that was Iran. Iran had a government that was struggling, and they were being, I don't know how you'd say, courted or being talked to by the Soviets. And that government was not very receptive to American ideology. So the U.S. decides to launch Operation Ajax, which was a planned coup d'etat, an overthrow of the Iranian government. And they put in charge an Iranian leader known as the Shah, S-H-A-H, that was much more open and receptive to American ideals. Now, this doesn't work out in the long run because after a couple of years, the Iranians themselves didn't like the Shah, and so they overthrew him. But we'll get to that a little bit later because that's a big event itself. But then the same thing kind of happens in Central America. An oppressive government that was the government itself in power wasn't leaning towards communism, but it was so oppressive and so hated by the Guatemalan people that the people themselves were starting to think about communism. And the U.S. launches Operation PB Success, which overthrows that state and government and puts in charge another government that was more American friendly. But again, that American friendly government was also very oppressive. And communist people in Guatemala still wanted to overthrow that, quote, democratic government. And I say, quote, democratic government because it wasn't, like, they called themselves democratic, but they were corrupt. Like, they were just as corrupt as any other government. So the people were sick of it, and they were turning towards communism. But that doesn't spread immediately. It'll happen later on. But that's the start of Eisenhower and brinkmanship. So continuing Eisenhower and brinkmanship, we see a brief time period where things between the U.S. and the Soviets kind of cool down. Tensions aren't as high. We have the Atoms for Peace and Spirit of Geneva, these two kind of summits or meetings between the two countries where they agree, like, we're gonna be civil. We're not gonna escalate things. Let's try and coexist. But then tension starts to pick back up again, starting with the Hungarian Revolt. The people of Hungary had grown tired of the communist regime that the Soviet Union had put in place, and the people started to rise up against it. Well, as soon as the revolt becomes somewhat serious, the Warsaw Pact countries move in and destroy it, put it down pretty violently. And so now the U.S. and the other democratic countries are starting to see that things are picking back up. Tensions are getting serious again. Then there's the launching of Sputnik. That Soviet satellite, first man-made satellite to travel space. So the Soviets are the first ones to get to space. And we know, well, we still hardly know anything about space itself, but we know way more now than we did in 1957. But in 57, we thought technology was endless and we could, who knows what the Soviets are doing with Sputnik. People honestly thought that they were spying on us. They thought that with Sputnik they could see in like each individual's living room. They're broadcasts on the radio talking about, hey, there's tonight, you should, if you go outside and look up in the stars, you'll be able to see Sputnik spying on you, which is, you can't. It's a tiny satellite, like the size, a little bit bigger than a basketball. And you can't see it. But if you're told that and you look hard enough, you'll find something that you'll convince yourself is Sputnik. But that motivates the U.S. to create NASA and launch our own space program, and then we get involved in what becomes known as a space race. Then we have the U-2 incident, which is the American spy plane gets shot down over the Soviet Union. And this is, I talked about it last year, but as a refresher, we had spy planes. They'd go over, they'd take pictures of what's going on in the Soviet Union, like of their military bases. Well, this plane flew too, I don't know if it was too low or too high, but either way, it got recognized by Soviet radar and they shot it down. Now Khrushchev releases a press statement to the public, to the world, that an American spy plane was shot down in the Soviet Union. And that's it. He leaves it vague. He doesn't say anything else. He does that on purpose. The U.S. assumes, or Eisenhower assumes, that it was a fiery crash, pilot's dead, nothing recognizable was found on board. So he tries to play it off as though that was a weather plane that was flying over Turkey and the pilot lost oxygen and it autopiloted into the Soviet Union when you saw it and shot it down. So we weren't spying. It was just a weather plane that got lost. And then Khrushchev comes out and says, no, we have your pilot in custody. He survived. The pilot, Francis Gary Powers, he ejected and he landed with a parachute and he was taken into custody. And this just makes the U.S. look stupid. Eisenhower looks dumb. And Soviets are furious because they're being spied on. Powers ends up being sentenced in a Soviet court case, sentenced to 10 years in jail with 7 years hard labor. He actually gets treated pretty well. He gets put up in a pretty nice little room, and he basically spends his whole day doing arts and crafts. He's released after 2 years. He's traded for a Soviet spy that was captured in America, Rudolf Abel. Now, the actual trade itself is depicted in a movie that was made a couple years ago called Bridge of Spies. And it's a really good movie. I think it's fascinating. It's got Tom Hanks in it. But that whole incident just makes the U.S. look bad, and it continues the building of tension in the Cold War. And then, as we've talked about a bunch of times, to flex their muscles even more, the Soviets test the Tsar bomb. And now we touch base on Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia, these little countries were once known as French Indochina. They're all French colonies. And then there's a communist uprising in North Vietnam led by a man named Ho Chi Minh. And they defeat the French. The French are just beaten. Like they're weakened after World War II, and their military can't even defeat the rebels in Southeast Asia. So the Geneva Conference is a meeting between all the world powers and then Southeast Asian leaders where they decide to split Vietnam. They give all those countries their freedom, and then they split Vietnam in half. North Vietnam is going to be communist. South Vietnam is going to be democratic. And Doles, John Doles, doesn't like this. He doesn't want any communism. He creates SEATO, Southeast Asia Treaty Organization. It's a Southeast Asia version of NATO. And it was just another alliance that promised we're going to fight communism as best we can. Doles's his hatred for communism is deep, and it'll come back to bite him a little bit later on. Cuba falls to communism. Fidel Castro takes power, deposes Fulgencio Batista. Batista was an American ally, and then Castro comes in, claims the U.S. has been taking advantage of Cuba, and they're the reason Cuba is poor. So he rises to power, becomes communist, cuts all ties with America, and aligns himself with Soviets. Like, he nationalizes the sugar industry in Cuba. Sugar was huge for, like, the U.S. needed Cuban sugar. And he nationalizes it and now says, all right, we're not going to trade, we're not going to sell it to America anymore. And that infuriates America. So America goes up, places an embargo, which is a ban of trade of any kind with Cuba, because we traded things with Cuba in return. And so we basically cut them off. And one of the things that we cut them off from was oil. That was a big deal. And so that's ultimately what drove the Cubans to the Soviet Union alliance, was now they could replace American goods with Soviet goods, which at the time seemed fine. Eventually, you know, when the Soviets run out of goods to trade, it doesn't work out very well. But America tries to assassinate or get rid of Castro many times. In fact, as powerful as America is, it's actually very impressive that Castro lived out his term as leader of Cuba. Well, he survived probably 8 or 9 American, whether it was invasions or assassination attempts. Now, a lot of these attempts were done through the CIA, which was recently created by the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency. And the first head of the CIA was a man named Allen Dulles, the brother of John Dulles, Secretary of State. Both of their hatred for communism makes this a very tense and combative time. So we're just now starting to heat things up. It's going to get even more tense. So today's essential question is, what is the concept of brinkmanship? What does it mean? I didn't have it listed in the notes, but I did say what it was. And if you remember anything or listened to any part of it, it should be pretty simple to explain. So that'll be it for today, right at 20 minutes. We got a week and a half left, so we're going to finish strong. We're going to get this taken care of. Keep working. Light is at the end of the tunnel. Hey, have a great day, guys. Thanks for tuning in.